Today's webinar is Into the Fire. Crisis Communication Starts with Preparedness. Our presenter today is Christopher Tarantino, CMCP. Chris Tarantino is a certified crisis management communications professional. As a graduate of RIT's Saunders College of Business with a degree in business administration and marketing, he leverages his social media public information and emergency management communications expertise to help government and public safety organizations communicate to citizens in times of disaster. Chris is CEO and lead instructor at Epicenter Media Training, a crisis emergency management consulting and training agency with a focus on technology and information communications management. He has nearly 10 years experience in emergency response and management, and in that time he has served in a variety of positions in the public and private sectors, including roles at the volunteer, local, county, state, and federal levels. Chris serves as a subject matter expert and instructor for the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. He is also a digital communications specialist for FEMA, the vice chair of the International Association of Emergency Managers Emerging Technology Caucus. He serves locally as a volunteer firefighter and EMT, a hazardous materials technician, and a rescue specialist with the Monroe County, New York Special Operations Unit, and he's a public information officer on the New York State Incident Management Team. Wow. And now I'm pleased to introduce RIT alumnus and today's presenter, Chris Tarantino. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you, Christine. That was a great introduction. So to give a little further background on what I do, I communicate and I help agencies communicate in the event of a disaster or a crisis. We're going to go over the difference between a crisis and an emergency or disaster in just a little bit. So where my background kind of comes from is from my education in RIT and then my background in emergency response. So I started off about 10 years or so ago in emergency medical services, then I got into the fire service, more into emergency management, which is really just the management of personnel, logistics, and information following a large-scale incident or disaster. So think snowstorms, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene, all those types of incidents that you're familiar with that have shown up on the news. That's kind of my bread and butter. So I kind of get called in to assist with social media, with information management, and public information topics and the like. So that's kind of why I'm here. That's kind of a little bit about me, but why are you here? The whole reason why I developed this webinar with RIT is to discuss how crisis communications, how important it is, and then also how you can actually prepare yourself and prepare your agency before something actually happens. So what things do you need in place? What knowledge do you need to have, the training, the expertise, and then what kind of mindset do you also need to have? So that's kind of the goal here. So I hope everybody's here for that. The main reason, at some core level, I believe we all agree with this quote. By the time you hear the thunder, it's too late to build the ark. I think that's a really beautiful quote to sum all this stuff up, because really we don't think in terms of preparedness. We don't think in terms of what will happen, what's the worst case scenario. Oftentimes we're reactive, not just as people, but as a society. And that really does come to a point when we have larger incidents or when our agencies or organizations are in crisis. And so what do we do beforehand? What can we do to prepare ourselves, prepare our agencies, to get our ducks in a row, if you will, so that way we do have our arc in place, so that way we actually have the faculties necessary to get the ball rolling and be prepared? How do we make sure that our agency gets the best foot forward, to make sure that our spokespersons actually know what they're talking about, so that way we sound educated, that way we sound credible? Those are the types of things that we're going to kind of outline today. So we only have about an hour, so before I dive right in, I just want to let everybody know that I am comfortable taking questions at any time during this presentation. Christine has told me that she'll interrupt me whenever necessary, ask any questions away, and I'll be sure to answer those as we go through the presentation. Also, if there's anything that's unclear, feel free to ask that as well. So what is crisis communications? Crisis communications, I have a little definition here, is the effort taken by an organization to communicate with stakeholders when an unexpected event occurs that could have a negative impact on the organization's reputation, personnel, mission, or key results areas. So this is anything that could affect the reputation, the people. It's not so much a life safety issue, and that's why below there I say that crisis communications deals with reputation management, and emergency or disaster communications, or those pertaining to risk, focus more on life safety concerns. This is a critical difference that I want to really paint a picture for you guys, because one can lead into the other. So we can have an emergency or some sort of disaster that will also lead to a crisis. Think the BP oil spill or something like that. Those could have been real life safety concerns. We could have had issues with property preservation or things like that. But it ended up really snowballing due to the media, due to the lack of training of spokespersons and things like that. It turned into a crisis communications event. So that's the main difference. We're going to talk in this presentation a little bit more about crisis communications because by looking at the attendees list, I kind of saw, not everybody in the audience is really dealing with life or death situations. You're not running into fires. You're not managing mass casualty incidents and things like that. But every single one of us deals with crisis in one way or another during our lives. So what exactly are we preparing for? We have all these disasters and emergencies, these crises that could pop up at any time. Cybersecurity is popping up more and more these days. Run-of-the-mill fires. We have everything as small as a motor vehicle accident all the way as large to a huge cyclone or a hurricane or something that impacts millions and millions of people. We have everything in between as well. We're not so much fighting, we're not so much managing the emergency or the crisis itself, so much as we are the perception. And that perception is what is really going to be left with people. And so what I want you guys to take away from this poll presentation is, we really need to manage expectations. We need to communicate what our goals are, and everyone needs to be on the same page, not just those that are involved in the response, but those that are watching the response or that may be on the periphery. So much of what we're dealing with these days involves social media. It involves international communities and what I call the increased globalization of disasters. Now, if we have a disaster, it's not just your neighbors that are involved. It's not just the next county over, but you could have neighbors, concerned citizens, family members all around the world talking to you within seconds based on your crisis or your incident. And what is actually going to rule there? Is it going to be the way things actually played out, or will it actually be the perception or the way that the media portrays the incident going on? These are the types of things that we need to prepare ourselves for. This is the crisis or disaster life cycle. This is something that we use in emergency management, but it absolutely pertains to corporate crises as well. We start off more in the mitigation or preparedness range. Mitigation are things that you do to lessen the impact or the risk of a disaster or crisis. Preparedness are ways that you actually get yourself ready. This is your training, your exercises, the education. Then we have the response and our recovery operations. Response is minutes, seconds after the incident occurs, all the way up into hours, maybe sometimes days, and then recovery is long-term. We are always recovering from crises or disasters. It goes back to the age-old adage that says that you can build up your reputation over decades, but it'll only take a second for it to be destroyed. This absolutely plays true here. So this cycle goes on. And where do we really spend most of our time, though? We spend most of our time and energy in that response phase because that's the sexy part. That's where people like to focus their energy because it's glamorous. It's nice to be the knight in shining armor, but where does the real progress show up? I think that really shows up in the recovery phase of things, when we're actually wrapping things up, or we actually talk about rumor management. We talk about misinformation that's occurred over the course of this whole crisis. And then also back into preparedness. And recovery and preparedness, I'll go back to the slide here so you can see, recovery and preparedness, along with mitigation a little bit, are really integral related. You can't have one without the other. And so what we're hoping is, even though this is a cyclical process and it goes round and round, that after you recover or as you're recovering from one incident, you are preparing more strongly and in a better way than you would have before. And so we're looking to get better than we were before. We're looking for that new normal to be something a little more productive. So where should we focus? We should focus a little more on preparedness. We can prepare in a number of ways. There are many things that we can do. We can get our communications plans in order. We can get our people just sitting at a table. I taught a class yesterday in Monroe County for FEMA the other day where we were talking about community leaders and how leadership in a community can drive action, how it can motivate people to do things when maybe government resources aren't available. These are the types of communications and the conversations that you need to have in your agency. So what level of leadership do you have in your organizations? Where are you going to take this energy, and how can you prepare? Are you going to look at education programs? Are you going to look at planning? Are you going to look at facilitation or exercises? What are you going to do for testing your systems? How do we get all of these things in order in a way that is sustainable, in a way that doesn't exhaust our resources, in a way that we don't become complacent. These are all the things that we're always kind of struggling with. And so I laid out a few different things that we can do. So for pre-planning, you can build your crisis response team. These are people that do well under stress. They do well in a crisis. These are folks that you're going to want as a crisis communications team. Those will be folks that are engaged in newer forms of media. Maybe they're social media savvy. They know about traditional communications. This sounds a lot like marketing or brand management. Crisis leadership team, this isn't necessarily your CEO or your CIO, your chief information officer. Though they may be involved, you may want someone completely separate. Oftentimes in corporate crises, the people that are involved are your top brass leadership. Do you want them in front of a camera when they're the ones that are under fire? Not so much, right? So we have a couple different things that work here. And then I talked again about spokespersons or public information officers. The PIO function, the public information officer function, that's a word that's usually used in emergency management. Spokespersons or spokespeople are the term that's usually used in more of the private sector realm of things. Both work. The goal of these people is to kind of offset some of the communication that's going on, maybe in the media or from some sort of an aggressor or something like that. Anybody who's trying to make you look bad, they're the people that are supposed to deflect some of that, to redirect some of that energy, to educate the public and to educate your stakeholders in a more significant way. They're the ones that are to be your bulletproof vest, to protect your mission, to protect your vision, maybe even to protect your cash flow. They're the ones that will help redirect some of the energy. So where do they actually get this information? A public information officer, a good public information officer, or a good spokesperson is going to be looking at the stakeholders. Who actually cares about the crisis that is evolving or, expanding in front of you? Where do they go from here? So what are we looking at? Who's involved? Those are going to be your demographics. You're going to be looking at psychographics. How do people think? Not only do we have a percentage of male and female or Anglo-Saxon or anything like that, but we also have the way people think. Are they early adopters? Are they very tech-savvy? Do they subscribe to one religion over another? Do they subscribe to one political belief over another? There are all these things that we can do, all these bodies of research that we can examine to better communicate, to more effectively communicate with the stakeholders that are involved. Look at the gaps in education. Look at the gaps in understanding. Do you know what level of education your personnel have? Okay. What actually do they know about the crisis? Have you engaged them in the crisis that you're dealing with right now? Oftentimes, when we have a larger incident, when we have something that is potentially devastating to a company or potentially devastating to a government entity, we keep that separate. The leadership keeps that separate from the boots on the ground. They say, oh, well, it's on a need-to-know basis. We're going to try and keep this hush-hush as much as we can. That's not a strategy that's going to work these days. And so what we see is when that happens, speculation just rules. And so what I say is, in the absence of information, misinformation will fill the void. And so we need to understand that. We need to actually understand and get in front of that before it occurs. So how about we instead have our top brass? How about we have our C-level leadership discussing with the lower levels, discussing with middle management and saying, look, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is how we're going to handle this. And ask for feedback, because any stakeholder that you have, whether it's internal or external, has a stake in what you're doing, in the outcome of this incident or crisis that you're dealing with. And it's important to remember that. So are your personnel prepared for a crisis, and what have you done to anticipate threats or hazards? Next thing that we talk about is a SWOT, or a strength, weakness, opportunity, threats analysis. What risks do you actually have? What are the threats to your organization, and have you evaluated them? What is the most significant hazard that is posing to your organization? What do you really think you have to deal with? We look at natural disasters, and I deal with those most frequently in the world. Natural disasters happen way more frequently than terrorism. But where do you think most of our Homeland Security dollars go? Where do you think most of our training is focused on? It's focused on terrorism because of the impact, because of the way that people are thinking. We have a question?
We do have a question.
Sure.
Sandy says, she's, I believe, referring to she says, shouldn't that create some sort of panic? I think referring to bringing in all the stakeholders and keeping everyone informed.
That is a great question. And so it could. It absolutely could. And so you have to weigh your options. I'm not saying this is a strategy for every single incident that you might deal with, but these days there's really no way to keep a secret. with social media and the way, the speed at which information is moving these days, it's more important to control your message and influence where it's going to go than it is to really just hamper it down and try and keep it a secret. Now, should you share every little thing? No. I mean, look at high-profile incidents like the Boston bombing. There are elements of that response that the general public still doesn't know, and nor should they, because there are certain elements that you will need to keep more under wraps. But the more you offer to your stakeholders, the less you allow them to speculate, the more in control you're going to feel, the better you can predict the outcome. So that way you're not blindsided as we move through the incident. And really, it makes them feel more a sense of ownership, a more sense of alliance to your organization and to your leadership. That all in the end of things is better for your organization, because the incident itself, remember that response phase is such a small portion of all of this. Now, you want to control and manage all that, sure, but more so in 5, 10, 15 years, you want to maintain your company culture. You want to maintain the corporate environment that you've worked for decades or centuries to build, right? And so that's really the goal of all this stuff. And so it's to keep people informed, but I do agree with you a little bit. You want to do that with a grain of salt. That's a great question. The main thing that we're looking to do here is anticipate your threats and hazards, and that's one of them. One thing is going to be panic. One thing is going to be speculation. And so as much as we can get out in front of it, the better. Here are some example threats. Now, this is definitely not everything. We have internal threats to our facilities, personnel, suppliers, distributors, anything that can hurt our bottom line, anything that can hurt our equipment, our infrastructure, things like that. We also have external hazards and threats. And the difference between a hazard and a threat, a hazard is essentially a natural process with the potential to harm, whereas a threat is something that is actually done to you, done against you. And so that's more of the terrorism, as well as something that may be a technological hazard or a hazmat release. So you see here, I have hazardous materials, weather, any sort of competition, somebody who's doing some bad dealing perhaps, the media, politics, anybody on the outside. The internal things we actually do a lot worse with managing, which is interesting because you'd think we would have more control. You'd think we would have more of an impact because we deal with internal stressors and internal threats, or those that have potential to become threats, much more frequently. But we are so terrified, and I say we, meaning organizations as well as in the government sector, we are terrified of the potential external hazards, the external stakeholders that could get out of control, the external mindset. And so we're constantly trying to manage those expectations, but we kind of forget, or maybe we just want to go blind to, the cancer that may be building within our own organization. So those are equal parts of all this crisis management, as well as the crisis communication piece. Next, once you understand your stakeholders, once you understand the things that we're dealing with, the potential threats or hazards that you might be faced with, next we have to develop some sort of policy or procedure to kind of combat those things. So what crisis action plans do you have? Now, a lot of organizations probably already have those. Whether you know that or not, maybe you need to talk to risk management, maybe you have to talk to your chief information officer. Someone probably has some working document, and maybe it's been in a dusty binder for the past 10 years. I know that happens in some government agencies as well, where we work on it for so long and then we just forget about it. And then what happens is we get into the disaster and we say, well, isn't there a policy on that? Well, yeah, there probably is, but we're going to do it this way, right? Why go through all the process? Why go through all the thought process on that when we're not actually going to use it? So actually take a look at this and see what your organization has said, what their priorities are. Looking at a crisis action plan is a great way to identify what your organization's true priorities are, because you can see what will come first, what will come before, right? What's going to be left to the bottom of the resource pile. In your crisis action plan, we hope that we have some sort of communications component. Whether you call it a crisis communications plan or not really doesn't matter. These days, we'll have a social media plan within that. You want to identify what your stance is on social media, not just will your personnel be using it, and here's a hint, they will, whether you say they will or not, okay? But also what your organization's stance is going to be. How will you manage those types of things? Will you enable and empower your personnel to use social media on your behalf? Be careful with that. Or will you say no social media whatsoever? And I know a lot of organizations are doing that as well. And so, or do you have a healthy medium of the two? I think that would be a little more natural. What is your traditional media plan? These are probably already outlined by your marketing department if you have one. Outreach and monitoring is probably blown into that, but not with a crisis spin on things. And so when I talk about outreach and monitoring, in a crisis, this is a little bit of a different flavor. So with outreach and monitoring, usually we're looking at brand management topics. We're looking at potential new markets of business. If you're a smaller company especially, you're looking for new opportunities and things like that. When you get into a crisis, though, you have to kind of switch gears a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more toward the end of the slideshow, but we really need to be monitoring for what's next. What are people starting to talk about? In a recent incident that I did, a snowstorm in western New York, we were able to actually look at the social media chatter in the morning, around 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and predict what the media was going to focus on throughout the day. With a 24-hour media cycle, it's even easier, actually, to see what they're going to focus on. And so what we saw in that incident was we saw the media discussing, hey, who has pictures of you plowing out your driveway? How many folks are actually engaging in sandbag operations today because we had some flooding? And so you could see where they were going to focus their energy, and we could get out in front of it a little bit. And so we were able to monitor those things and inform our own response activities in a way. So that's kind of where we get into communications, but also into operations as well. Develop your messaging around risks that were included in that risk analysis that we talked about. Develop canned messages or holding messages. A canned message is essentially a message that you have already pre-scripted, pre-typed up, ready to go. All you have to do is fill in the blank. So I know a lot of agencies have those related to tornadoes, related to snowstorms and things like that. Essentially, you know, it'll say, there is an incident at, insert address here, we are responding by, insert action here, things like that. And that goes to the same type of message as a holding message. A holding message is your first message that you send out, whether that be via press release, whether that be by a social media post or a Twitter post or something like that, or as an email internally to your personnel. A holding message just says, we are aware of, insert your incident here, and we are responding by, insert your protocol or action here. And we will follow up in, insert time frame here. This basically says, stop calling the emergency numbers for our emergency personnel on the call, all right? Stop calling 911, or stop sending emails to your supervisors. We're dealing with it. We're working on it. Give us a little bit of space, and we will follow up with you. Now, you have to honor that. That's a promise that you are giving your stakeholders, both internally and externally. You want them to know and trust, I will keep you informed. Come to me for the information. And that's how we make sure that risk and that crisis response, that human nature, flight or flight, that we can really maintain and manage that panic that could actually happen. So this should be proactive, but is of course reactive too. I believe we talked about that earlier today. So build your partnerships. You're going to want as many people in your corner as you can. Who's already partnering with you? Who will help you maybe amplify your messages? Who will help you correct misinformation? You're going to need more than just your core group of personnel. You're going to need all hands on deck, everybody to be your ears, eyes, and even sometimes your mouth. So what assistance do you need, whether it's in-house or not? Who are the influencers? Who's actually going to hold the microphone? Because oftentimes it's not going to be you. You may be able to influence the conversation, but you will probably not own it. And that's really uncomfortable for a lot of folks, especially in the public information world. So share content and provide resources. Make sure that you're providing value. You want them to come back to you because then you get to hold your own microphone for longer. Establish thought leadership and recognize that all these people on the right-hand side, the general community, the media, any sort of partners that you have, and especially your employees, are all critically vested in the outcome of this crisis. One note on that, every employee is a PR representative and crisis manager for your organization, whether you want them to be or not. That's a Jonathan Bernstein quote. So everybody close your eyes really quick and think of the weakest link in your organization. All right, does everybody have them? All right, the blubbering, not so coordinated person in your office that really you would never want to put in front of a microphone, you'd never want them in front of a camera. They are, in fact, doing that these days. Every single employee has the ears and eyes of the world within an instant, because before, if we had said weakest link in our ranks, and the cameras were coming around and the microphones were being shoved in people's faces, we would maybe send them to a back room and say, hey, why don't you go occupy yourself somewhere else? We could keep them out of the limelight. But now, with social media, it's almost impossible. Everybody gets to run their own show. Everybody who has a cell phone, anyone who has any sort of social media account can be your crisis manager as well as your spokesperson for your organization. So let me ask, how many of us are training that weakest link? How many of us in our organizations are actually educating those folks to be in that capacity? Or do we let them know, hey, look, if this is ever happening to you, this is what you should do. This is who you should notify. I think a lot of times we hope and pray that that won't ever happen, but we don't train our folks, we don't train our people to respond to it. So just kind of remember this quote. So train your people and test your systems. This graphic here is from FEMA. It's from the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program. And while you guys may not be doing anything related to Homeland Security, you can absolutely use this matrix. And so the way this kind of works is a stepwise process, starting with seminars and workshops, working up in capability, working up in integrity, to games and drills, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises. So a seminar, that's more of your classroom type stuff. A workshop, you usually produce something. You have a workshop to build maybe your crisis communications plan or your policy. A tabletop exercise is essentially a guided exercise through a scenario where you talk about different things. You're not moving around, you're not moving resources and stuff, but you're talking about the outcome and you're discussing what your protocols would be. Games kind of have a dual relationship to it where they're kind of in the middle, where we have group exercising, and then maybe we'll have another group that's testing that individual or that team. Then we have drills, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises. This is where you're moving people, you're actually doing the briefs, you're maybe managing a media interview, you're getting people up and about, you're actually testing people, you're stressing people out. So we're going up in intensity as we go up in this stepwise production, okay? So don't forget, though, regular systems and technology testing. So none of this will work. None of your training is actually going to be orchestrated correctly, and none of your operations are actually going to work if your technology doesn't work, all right? If your systems go down, if people are not familiar with those systems or with those processes. There's no use, like I said, to have a plan or a policy if no one is ever going to reference it. And so just kind of remember that, and remember test training and exercise really are at the core of preparedness, because then we start to build the initiative. We start to get people engaged in the actual mission of crisis management. We get them engaged with the mission of your organization, and we ally them more closely to a positive outcome as opposed to spinning stories or spinning lies, right? We don't want that to happen. Let's change gears for a second. Do we have a question again?
We do have a quick question.
Yeah.
How much time do you advise an organization put into training and testing versus the planning?
Oh boy, that is a loaded question if I ever heard one. I would say all the time, but then again, I own a training and consulting company, so I think I'm a little biased. I really think you should spend a significant amount of time. A lot of times this gets swept under the rug, and so we're always dealing with the day-to-day. Look at typical companies and organizations following a disaster, and I'm speaking in the realist sense of the term, so a snowstorm, hurricane, anything like that. Most companies, 80% of companies will not recover from that disaster. They will not even open after a major incident. That means only 20% of your organizations will actually come back because they did the training, because they actually thought about continuity of operations, because they thought of those things. And I think that's a really critical lapse in the private sector as well as the public sector, where we don't give enough of our time. We don't give enough of our energy or our resources to training and exercising. So to give an amount, I mean, I'd like to say 100, but then we would never get anything done. I'd really like to say that for every hour that you are spending working, you should be thinking about 10 minutes. What would happen if I couldn't do this work, right? What would happen if there was something else going on? And I don't know, if I really like that ratio, but you get the idea. You should be thinking about this all the time. It's not so much how much time you should spend, but what type of mindset should you always have? It's not so much, well, on Mondays we train, okay? On Tuesdays we do business as usual. It really won't work that way. It needs to be integrated into the culture. It needs to be integrated into the business environment as well as into your personnel in general. The other thing that I'd like to note with that is it doesn't just work if your employees are prepared at work, right? If your employees are ill-prepared at home, they're not even going to be there for you when you have a crisis. And so that goes right back to things. If there's trouble at home, there's going to be trouble at work. We've heard that before. It goes right back to that whenever there's a crisis and emergency too. So take care of your people. Right? Do we have another question too?
A follow-up comment,
sure.
Just underlining your statement about the time that's needed to devote to planning, saying if you have the disaster, you don't have time for planning anymore. So
absolutely true. You don't have much time for planning. And in the event of a disaster, in those minutes where you're managing the crisis itself, that's really the last time you want to be planning for things. You want to have things already outlined. We say in the emergency response world, the time to exchange business cards is not at the command post. It's not actually at the incident. You should be talking with people. You should be building your plans and your policies and things well before that, right? Let's change gears for a second here. We've done the planning. We've discussed how preparedness can impact your response and things like that. But once an incident occurs, we should activate our plans as soon as possible. We should do the necessary things that we need to do so that way our agency can come out on top. So what should we do? First off, we need to know our main priorities. We have to know what the leadership is looking for. We have to know what the masses want. We have to know what our stake is in the game. Right? Is this actually your crisis, or does it just look like your crisis? And a lot of times we see larger companies try to turf their disaster off onto somebody else. Well, it was actually our supplier's fault. Well, it was actually the equipment malfunction. It wasn't us. It wasn't our negligence. It wasn't our equipment malfunction. It was somebody else's. So we need to kind of know where we're at in all of this. So leadership often just wants compliance. They want things to be back in order. They want normalcy. They want the training to be in place, but they also want people to act appropriately once the incident occurs. They want those policies that they've read to actually go off the way that they're written. They would like confidentiality. Now, I don't always think they're going to get it, especially in the 21st century in the social media age. It's really not going to happen for them the way that they'd like, potentially, but it can happen in a certain environment where you manage those expectations. They're looking for seamless communications. They're looking for the order or the directive that they give to be seamlessly carried out throughout all levels of your organization. From that, though, they also want the communication to be brought out to the stakeholders in a manageable and sustainable way. So how do you actually do that? How do you get leadership engaged in this response? How do you get them involved in the crisis communications without them meddling, without them micromanaging? Because oftentimes we get the top brass leadership coming into where we're trying to manage the incident, and they have just slightly different priorities than the rest of us. Your crisis response team should be trying to establish normalcy, or that new normalcy that we're trying to strive for. They shouldn't necessarily be looking out for the reputation of the CEO. Okay, and that's a really difficult place to be in when your CEO may be the one under fire, but the organization itself can distance themselves from their CEO. Now that's really tough, because then you have conflicting priorities, then you have a whole mess of things to deal with. But that's the reality in crisis. It's not always pretty. Well, it rarely is. What do the masses want? We have the leadership on one side, and we also have the masses, or the stakeholders that we're dealing with. How can we be transparent with stakeholders while observing that confidentiality that our leadership really wants us to employ? That's a really tough balance. And so we need to let people know what we're dealing with. We have to talk a little bit more about our strengths and our weaknesses. We have to advise them of our capabilities. We don't do that very well. I'll speak kind of from the government side of things. We really don't do that very well because we're more or less terrified of our stakeholders. We don't want people to know where our shortcomings are, and that's the same in the private sector as well. We don't want our competitors to know that we're weak in X area. We don't want people to know that we're weak in our communications. We don't want those things to happen. So we should be communicating early and often. I noticed that we have a question in the chat box.
We do. It's a really detailed question from Stephanie, but I think this is a good time to take it.
Sure.
She asks, how do you communicate a deviation from protocol or plan? When we run drills and exercises in our incident command center at the hospital, we do well when we stay with our plan and protocols, but when something changes, you can't plan for everything, that's when the communications breakdown happens. So how do you combat that? How do you respond to those unexpected changes in plan?
That is a great question. And so oftentimes what we see is we have these protocols in place, and like we're saying here, when the protocol is in place and when we act by the protocol, things more or less run smoothly. We've done it before, we've practiced it, and like we say, practice makes perfect, but what happens when we actually have a deviation of that protocol? That's how I understand the question. So first off, what happens is the leadership makes some decision that may not be congruent with their initial planning. Now, we have to remember, we have to try and make deviations from protocol our absolute last resort. That's the first thing. Because we go into our planning processes, we spend hours, days, sometimes weeks or months at developing these plans and these procedures, these protocols that we deal with. But then in the event of an incident, we're all flustered, we're very stressed, we're not thinking very clearly. We have looked at this incident through a very tight lens, we're looking through tunnel vision, and we say, well, we can't do it that way this time. Well, maybe we should pump the brakes a little bit and look at the protocol once again that we spent months, weeks, days working on. Maybe the protocol actually does fit and you need to do a smaller tweak. Oftentimes we tweak a little too far. We go way too far out of protocol. When we go that far out of protocol, that's when the deviations start to really hurt us. That's when the communications breakdowns happen. And so what can we do when we really do really do analyze the fact that we do need a deviation or protocol of a larger magnitude? The first off, we need to identify where that deviation was approved. We need to let people know this is what we're doing. This is what leadership has advised. This is our playbook. If you don't have anything drawn up, the sooner you can get something in front of people for them to consistently reference, the better, right? Well, a lot of times we'll just have a standing order. Someone will bark it over a table, yell it over a radio, especially in emergency response, and they'll say, this is how we're going to do things now. Nobody has a memo in front of them. Nobody has any sort of stepwise process that they can follow, no step-by-step procedure. They don't have a plan that they can reference. Basically, all the training that you gave them, all the exercising that we did to prepare them for that moment, you can basically throw in the garbage because somebody just threw it out, right? And so we kind of have to be aware of that. We have to know our people very, very well. And so the other part of this is just knowing what deviations our personnel are actually capable of enacting. So oftentimes we'll have our leadership say, well, we should do it this way. Right, I had a classic example when I used to teach emergency medical technician training. I had a classic example of a paramedic who could, give medications, they can give IVs, they can do all different kinds of narcotics and things like that, of directing a firefighter to do a tracheotomy on scene. Okay, that's a big deviation, and I don't think it's going to work out well for any of them involved, least of all the patient. And so we really need to pay attention to what we're asking our people to do and if they're actually capable of it. The best thing that we can do may be that deviation, but if our people can't carry it out, that's the worst thing we can do, right? I hope that kind of makes sense. And I saw another question up here. Why must we communicate to the masses? So kind of changing gear again. What's the main reason? The main reason is the masses control a lot more of your outcome than you do. Whether we like to admit that or not. They control the perception, they control the media. Whether the media wants to admit that or not is to be seen. They control the way that stockholders will actually vote. They control a lot of different things. And so the better we can have the public perceive our incident, the stronger we can come out in our crisis or in our emergency, the better we're going to look at the end of the day. The better we look at the end of the day, and we go back to this brand management piece, it's always coming back to brand management, the better we look at the end of the day, the more successful we're going to be in the next incident, the more trust we're going to have following the next incident, right? All of this is a balance and a give and take of trust, of command and control, of influence. And so we kind of have to just work with that. We have to realize and understand that the public and the masses, and the masses I see as internally, your employees especially, as well as your external stakeholders, they're the ones that really hold the leash, okay? We'll go back to the slides if there aren't any further questions. Those were great questions, by the way, guys. Thank you very much. One thing we need to know, in addition to our priorities, is to maintain situational awareness. We have to understand where things are going. And I wish I clicked that right before we had that final question, because understanding the trends is something that really comes from the masses. What the masses are paying attention to is where the media is going to go, right? The media is going to then drive. It's going to be this whole cyclical process, this whole angry mob, or hopefully not, right? Where we need to maintain that awareness. We need to understand where the trends are going so that way we can get out in front and start to get control. One of our main goals in incident command and any sort of emergency response is called containment. Right? And I think we can take that in the private sector and use that word as well. Containment is not so much in the literal sense with a hazmat incident where we're trying to contain some sort of toxic chemical, but really the toxicity of the communications environment that we might be operating in. That's what we can contain, and that's why we need to understand the trends. What we see here is what we know, what we know we know, what we don't know we don't know, and what we know we don't know, right? Now this is a three-part pie chart here. I stole this from the military, and it's usually called the red slice. Now the red slice is the most dangerous piece of this, and I have it here as the orange slice, typical RIT fashion. What we don't know is what will hurt us. We tend to think that we know everything. We, especially in an emergency operations center in the world where I work, we love to think that we know everything, right? We know where people are, we know how many people are injured, we know what apparatus are in play, and we know everything about the incident. But so many times when I've been in an emergency operations center, the nerve center, the brain of an incident, I've walked outside that door and gone, huh, it's raining outside? Well, wait a minute. If I'm supposed to know everything about this incident and I don't even know what the weather is in my location, what type of blind spots am I really missing, right? And I use that analogy with emergency responders, but it works the exact same way in the corporate world, in the event of a crisis, with your crisis communications. You don't know a lot more than you know, right? And that's really, really tough. So the strongest decision-making ability that you have is really to observe that, to try and reduce that orange slice that we're talking about, because it is the most dangerous aspect. That's where our weakest elements are going to be. And so we need to know when to bring in an expert. We need to know that our strongest decision-making capability is really going to be our biggest asset there. We go back to the communications thing. We talked about why we should talk to the masses, why we need to talk to our employees and our internal and external stakeholders. What I kind of see is the internal communications is really the brain. It's the nerve center of our operations. We need to have those in place. PA systems, your emails, your phone trees. This is where you're going to communicate those deviations of protocol that we were talking about earlier. You also want to have in place your contingency plans. If anything fails, right? What if all your communications go down? Maybe you weren't doing your tests or your systems-wide, evaluations of your communications protocol. Maybe you're not looking at your server racks. Maybe anything could have failed, right? Any sort of cybersecurity incident. Now what? What do you do? In the private sector especially, we don't think about continuity very often. We think of continuity of operations or continuity of government, right? What if the president gets ill, or if the president is killed, we go to the vice president. You know, if the vice president is, we have this whole framework that goes very, very deep. Well, what happens if your phone lines are down? Does everybody in your organization have the same answer to what your contingency plan is? I would imagine that they don't, right? So you got to pay attention to the contingency. You should have those laid out beforehand as well. So maybe if email's not working, or maybe if the PA system isn't working, this is going to be our next form of communication. You're going to have your primary, your alternate, your contingency, and your emergency. We call that pacing. P-A-C-E, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, right? Then you'll have your traditional and your social media, and this is where you're engaging with the public. What live communications channels do you have? What on-demand channels do you have? Where are your press releases going to be? And do all of these communications, while they're layered, do they also influence each other? They absolutely do, right? Our traditional communications are impacting our social media communications, and we can use this as a force multiplier for us to impact our strategy here. So maybe we send out a tweet. In that tweet, we reference our press release. In that press release, we reference our YouTube channel. In that YouTube channel, we talk about our measures that we're doing, right? We keep people in our own little bubble, right? That's how we maintain that control or that influence over our messaging, so that way people aren't going to other sources. If you provide people, if you feed the beast, we use that in the media, if you feed the beast and let people know what you're doing, you inform them as often as you can, you will walk out on top, because you'll be able to manage this at a comfortable level as opposed to racing to catch up. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, and I'm surprised I haven't gotten a question on it yet, but what do you do when there's misinformation out there? We've talked about the potential for it, but what do you actually do when something happens, right? So be proactive is number one. You need to know what's going on. That goes back to your trends. It goes back to your stakeholder analysis. It goes back to those demographics and the psychographics. What do you think people are going to think? What do you think people are going to assume following this incident or this crisis, right? What would you think if you heard this over a dinner table? What would be the first thing out of your mouth? That's how we can be proactive with these things. Now, in addition to being proactive, that's not going to help you with everything, right? Go back to that orange slice. There's a lot of information out there that we're not going to see necessarily. How do we monitor? How do we watch for trends? Are we answering questions? Are we actually posting information out there and broadcasting images, explaining jargon, talking about things that maybe the media has twisted in a certain way, or maybe you want to clarify? Are we doing that at all times? This is a 24/7 process, right? We don't just go home at 5 o'clock and say, well, we kind of did okay today. We'll try again tomorrow. If the media doesn't shut off and the public doesn't shut off, your crisis communications team cannot shut off. Do you have the capacity for that? when we go back to our personnel complications, right? When you see misinformation, you observe that something is going on, you should verify it. See who's talking about it, see what's going on, right? Log those instances and document it for, oh, see, here I am using jargon here. The AAR stands for After Action Review or After Action Report. Essentially, this is for your learning. So that way, at the end of things, after you demobilize, after we de-escalate, right, we have a review. We have some sort of recovery operation, and we can say, look, this happened. This is why it happened, this is what we did, and this was the result, right? You should have a really clear trajectory on all of those pieces of information, so that way we can actually see the cause and effect relationship. Next, we want to broadcast the official info. This is where your partnerships come in. We should be correcting influencers. You should link to the official info, publicly thank the influencers. This information is really, really important, so that way we let people know, thank you for sharing the correct information. Thank you for going to our blog first. Thank you for telling us that somebody was saying this about us, so that way we could get out in front. Those are the people that you want on your side. Those influencers, those advocates, those brand ambassadors are the ones that you're going to want by your side. Once this is all happening, all this is going to happen within seconds, I guarantee. It can spiral out of control very, very fast. You should notify your leadership or the public information officer, those spokespersons. You need to let them know. They should not be blindsided as they're going to a media briefing on what's happening on Twitter right then at that moment. You should try and communicate with them as much as you can, so that way they're not blindsided. Because as soon as that spokesperson is blindsided on live television or on some sort of live broadcast, the media, the public, they're going to run with that. And it's going to make you look bad even if they weren't in the wrong, even if they didn't say something incorrectly, even if they didn't lie, just the stuttering and the messed up speech, that will get you in trouble, right? So follow up after that. I did see we had one more question.
We do. There's some background from Sanda, but I can condense it very quickly. She's in an area where a couple crises have arisen, and instead of the masses getting very involved in the information, there wasn't a lot of interest from the general public. There wasn't a lot of attention paid by the general public, and her role requires assistance from the general public. What do you do when there's indifference or disconnect?
That's actually a huge opportunity. So what I'm hearing from you here is that we have some sort of incident. The public hasn't taken off with it as much as we may have expected or maybe what we anticipated, but we still need their involvement. We need them to weigh in on something. We need them to vote on something, right? And this often happens following some sort of larger incident. How do we get them involved in a way that's sustainable, right? That's a good opportunity. The reason why I say that is because right then you have a marketing issue, not so much a crisis issue. You get to control how you roll that out. You get to control how your organization is portrayed, and you get to discuss the successes and shine some light on things that were done well. You get to talk about the human successes. You get to show the hug pictures, right? You get to show people what was done really, really nicely. And that's how you can start to position the conversation around that way. So you have to do that carefully, right? You don't want it to get out of control once you bring that up. That would be shooting yourself in the foot, per se. But we can do that in an effective way just by getting out in front, talking with people on their level and saying, look, this is why this is important to you. This is how it will affect you, and this is what we're doing to ensure that the best outcome possible is happening right now. And if we need them to weigh in, we need to identify exactly what we need from them, exactly what we expect of them, and exactly what they can expect of us. And then we go right back to that frequency and that follow-up that we have on the bottom of this slide. Empower your stakeholders with the correct information, and just watch out for any sort of viral content. Watch out for any sort of trends that might be trending in the opposite direction of what you want. That's the follow-up piece that'll maintain your success. That's a great question. Along with this, and this goes right with your question here, we need to know how information spreads. We only got a couple slides left. But we see information spreading in a very different way these days with social media. It's not so much the broadcast only. It's not top down. And so we need to know that we're not going to be the only people. Our organization is not going to be the only organization talking about this. We have citizen journalists. We have radio and television. We have just the general public, that kind of nebulous term that we use. And then we have, more official sources. We have the media. We have any sort of, legal sources, any sort of political sources. We need to recognize that it's no longer centralized, it's no longer top-down. They're distributed networks of information. They influence each other, they correct each other, they inform each other. There's varying levels of trust and credibility. I can safely say, without a doubt, I would bet every one of my paychecks on it, that every bit of misinformation will be corrected on social media. how can I say that so confidently? There are so many people. It's the law of large numbers. Eventually, all misinformation will be corrected, but the difference here is that I have to use the word eventually, right? It will eventually be corrected. Now, that may be in lifetimes from now, but I don't know. Our goal as crisis communicators and as emergency communicators is to shorten the amount of time it takes for us to get in control of that message, to actually correct that misinformation, and start talking about things that are actually happening. Start channeling that energy where we need it to go. If you think you're in control, you're fooling yourself, though. As soon as you start listening, you realize you're not in control, and letting go will yield more and better results. I love this quote by Charlene Lee. This is a really, really nice quote for when we're talking about social media, when we're talking about misinformation. You are not going to get every piece of misinformation corrected the way that you necessarily wanted it to, or in the time frame that you want it to be corrected in. But we can just kind of mold with this. We have to roll with the punches. We have to look at acceptable losses. Is it okay for this to maintain? Is this okay for us to contain and leave this here? Is this okay for us to get out in front of? Should we be more aggressive with this one piece of information, right? And that goes all the way back to our initial discussion on knowing your priorities. This is a quote from a prestigious individual. It's actually myself, so I don't know how much I agree with that. But every incident is an opportunity for increased organizational resilience. Every single incident. And I think if we look at it this way, we will be more successful. And so crisis communication, whether that be the largest scale incident that your organization has ever faced, or even the smallest little scandal that's affecting your lunchroom or your cafeteria, we need to look at this as an opportunity to manage culture, an opportunity to manage people, to test our training, to test our systems, our exercises and things like that, and to grow. And remember that cycle: preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation. Round and round that cycle will go. It's going to go on with or without you, and so we need to look at how we can seize those opportunities and come out on top with the new normal.
Wow, Chris, thank you so much for sharing all of this information, and thank you to all the participants for the excellent questions. We have time for perhaps one more question, and I see we've got one asking about how to manage the key differences between public and private sector crisis communication, or rather, are there key differences between public and private sector crisis communication?
That's an interesting question. There are some differences and there aren't. It's another loaded question here because the same principles really ally with both. And so while there may be differences in priorities, I think that's where we're going to see the majority of our differences. You know, in government, we're really not worried about the bottom line too much. I mean, just look at our debt ceiling right now. We're not so much concerned with things like that, but we are concerned with expectations. We are concerned with the perception of an incident, right? And so those things transcend whether private sector, public sector, non-governmental organization. All of those principles really are the same. And so you can look at this slideshow. We're going to send it out to you guys after the webinar. You can look at this slideshow with any sort of lens. You can put any sort of incident on this and say, well, what would I have done in the event of X? All right, now we've gone along with this for a little while. What would I do now that Y is occurring, right? And so what do I need to do? It all comes back to your priorities and just knowing your organization and what you're looking to do.
Great, thank you. Well, I know there are probably still some lingering questions, but that's all the time we have today. You can send your additional questions straight to Chris at the information that you see on screen, or you can send them to us here at RIT. The address is ritalum@rit.edu, or you can tweet them to @RIT_alumni using the hashtag #MeRITWebinars, since we've been talking so much about social media, and we'll direct your questions to Chris. And of course, as Chris mentioned, we will be sending you an email that will link you back to this webinar recording complete with captions. So thank you so much for being our speaker today, Chris. I learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners learned a great deal, and they will be a little more prepared should the need arise. And we hope that you come back and join us all for the next installment of Me RIT on Tuesday, January 13th. We will have another RIT alumnus, Reuben Zielinski. He's the co-founder and COO of Revive Electronics, and he'll be sharing his considerable insights into successfully building a business. So stay tuned for that email inviting you. You'll be able to register for this webinar and several more coming up at rit.webex.com.